Yeah, it's been a while, and we are back at Steady Insights. I've been thinking, and in fact, let me ask you, what is the most precious metal in the world? Gold? Diamond? Silver? Well, no. The most precious metal is called rhodium. 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 And as per statistics, it can cost just for an ounce about $10,000. Wow, that's an interesting fact. We are going to discover a lot about precious metals in this episode.
And here we are, episode 5, The Nations Part 2. I've been thinking about precious metals, and I can really conclude that they are the wealth that built empires. Let me give you these fascinating scientific and natural facts. You know, gold is rare. It's mind-blowingly rare. Why do I say this? All the gold ever mined totals around 201,296 metric tons. This is according to the World Gold Council in 2023. And that is just enough to fill 2 Olympic-sized swimming pools. But the truth of the matter is, aside gold, silver is the most electrically conductive metal. Did you ever know this? Silver is made very essential not only for coins, but also for modern technology. For example, in every smartphone, at least most smartphones, you can have about 0.25 grams of silver in its circuits. The most valuable metal is not gold, it's actually rhodium. As of recent figures, rhodium can exceed 10,000 pounds per ounce, and that is about 5 times more than gold. Why do I begin with all these wonderful scientific facts? As we continue in our exploration of how nations play a part in the age-long conflict between good and evil, we now focus on how God reveals the storyline of this great controversy, not in vague terms, but through clear symbols and prophetic visions. As we will discover, even metals have a place in the prophecies that we are learning. It is no surprise that God wants us to know the development of the history of the open conflict between good and evil, between Christ and Satan. And this conflict didn't unfold in the shadows. It's been openly played out across human history, with nations often being the visible platforms on which this battle occurs. For this reason, God has showed prophets the different stages of the conflict, especially those related to the role of nations. And the main source of this knowledge is found in the book of Daniel, then of course with John in the book of Revelation, being the one who received the most information about the final stage of the conflict. So basically, Daniel introduces us to the long journey of the nations, and John carries it to its climax. The two prophets, separated by centuries, present a united timeline from Babylon, as we will know, to the end of time. Now, this brings me to the root of our discourse in this episode. We will look at the knowledge of good and evil. Then we will delve deeper into the knowledge of history, where we will consider precious metals and some very fascinating beasts. Then we will look at the knowledge of the end time as we go through the land and the sea and the remnant people. Stay with me so that we journey through these layers of understanding. It will be simple in structure but profound in impact. The knowledge of good and evil. In other words, what I call the very first commandment. It is an established fact that Eve was tempted to become equal with God, acquiring the knowledge of good and evil, and apparently she succeeded. Well, did she? At the very beginning, humanity's curiosity was not the problem. It was actually disobedience. The temptation wasn't just to know, but to know like God without trusting His timing. And this knowledge has been clearly restricted to them by God. The question is, why did God withhold the knowledge of good and evil from the first couple? Well, timing matters. Just like a child isn't given fire to play with, God knew that understanding evil without spiritual maturity would be destructive. And it is no surprise that when you read Genesis 3, you see that this knowledge brought them nothing good. By being seduced by the serpent and knowing what is right from wrong, and by choosing wrong, they learned evil through experience. This mistake was repeated by Israel when they asked for a king, as we discovered in 2 Chronicles 12 verse 8. Again, people wanted control. Israel, like our first parents from Eden, sought worldly structure, ignoring that God's plan was different. What was the result? They tasted domination under other nations, just as Adam and Eve tasted shame after the fruit. Here is where we come to the knowledge of history after our first parents. Just as God exposed spiritual truths in Eden, He later unveiled political truths through the dreams of metals and beasts, teaching us how empires rise and fall, but more importantly, how His kingdom outlasts them all. And that is why I did begin with an opener on scientific facts around gold, for example. Let me delve deeper. You know that precious metals are actually linked with world powers. Did you know that? For example, ancient Egypt was built through the power of gold. In fact, the Nubian mines in modern day called Sudan supplied so much gold that pharaohs were called lords of the two lands and of gold. Again, the Spanish Empire's global dominance from the 1500s to the 1600s was fueled by silver. Between 1500 and 1800, Spain extracted more than 180,000 metric tons of silver from mines in Bolivia and Mexico. And that is equivalent to over 80% of global silver production at that time. We cannot go on without mentioning the United States of America. The United States' global currency dominance actually stems from partly the gold standard. In fact, until 1971, the US dollar was directly backed by gold, and this reinforced its role as the world's reserve currency. In fact, precious metals have not just glittered, they have governed. Nations that mastered access, mining, and control of metals often dictated global economies, ideologies, and wars. Let me become more practical in terms of prophecy. In Daniel chapter 2, we see a very fascinating story unfold. King Nebuchadnezzar was shown the history of the nations through a terrible-looking statue. And you can find this in Daniel chapter 2, verse 31 through 45. This wasn't a work of art, no. It was actually a message carved in metal. God used the body of a statue to reflect the timeline of human power. golden and glorious at first, but degrading over time. Daniel's description of the nations, which are Babylon from 605 to 539 BC, again Medo-Persia from 539 to 331 BC, then Greece from 331 to 168 BC, Rome, which came into existence in terms of power from 168 BC to 478 AD, then finally divided Rome from 476 AD up until now. Then most importantly, the eternal kingdom represented by stone. Each of these metals had meaning. Babylon was gold, rich and glorious, then silver, then bronze, iron, and finally iron mixed with clay. In totality, power declines and unity becomes impossible. You can see clearly, per this presentation, that the progressive devaluation of metals announced a progressive decline of humanity. As the metals dropped in value, so did human values. A golden head gave way to a feet made of unstable clay, showing how human governments over time become more fragile and more fractured. For example, the Industrial Revolution, along with the theories of men like Darwin and Marx, have led us to believe that humanity can improve. Well, you can answer for yourself if that is true. Instead of unity, we got world wars. Science, of course, did grow, but morality shrank. We reached the moon, but lost touch with our maker. What happened to the utopia that humanism promised? The prophecy already warned us. Humanity is rapidly degenerating, especially morally. But enough of those metals, enough of Daniel's interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Are you aware that actually there are also fascinating beasts? You know, Nebuchadnezzar dreamt, but God finds a way to repeat the same vision, not this time with metals, but with beasts. And it's so fascinating that animals have also played roles in civilization. Let me give you some surprising biological and historical facts. Elephants are mega engineers. Did you know that? African elephants can tear down trees, dig water holes, and create grazing paths. They can literally reshape ecosystems. And the most interesting of all, a full-grown elephant can eat up to 300 pounds of food per day. Not only the elephant. For example, honeybees also sustain civilizations silently. Do you know what they do? They pollinate about 70 of the 100 crop species that feed 90% of the world. Wow. Yet bee populations have declined over 30% in recent decades, and that is a growing ecological crisis. It is clear that animals also have a role to play, even in prophecy. When you look at the book of Daniel, in the 7th chapter, God actually repeats the vision he had given through Nebuchadnezzar in the context of metals. But the question is, why repeat the succession of world empires again in another vision? Because metal alone didn't tell the whole story. Wow. The beasts add emotion and movement. So while metals were static symbols of value, beasts now show violence, ambition, and unrest. So it's clear that we see here the use of beasts, namely lion being Babylon, a bear with ribs represented as Medo-Persia, leopard with wings representing Greece, Then a terrible beast, which stands for Rome. Finally, then a little horn, representing divided Rome. Each animal represented a nation, but more importantly, their behavior. So the lion devours, the bear crushes, the leopard is swift, and the final beast is terrifying and unnatural. First, to make clear the certainty of its fulfillment, God actually had repeated this vision in a different form to reinforce the truth, because he wants us to understand, and not just understand, but remember. Secondly, he did that to show the relationship of God's people to the history of the nations. Daniel received the beast vision, not a king. This vision was not for the rulers, but for the faithful remnant, showing how their journey would be affected by each empire. So it is very clear that these nations would not arise peacefully, but as a result of wars. Nations don't evolve, they emerge from chaos. Each beast came up not with calm, but through a stormy sea of strife. And it's so fascinating to know that through all this discourse, Israel is not involved in the conflict, but unfortunately, merely a victim. Let's now consider the knowledge of the end time. So we see that the past prepares us for the future. If metals and beasts revealed what was, the sea and the land now will tell us what is yet to come. More importantly, when you consider the land and the sea in the context of prophecy, especially in the book of Revelation, the sea represents wars and disorder. In other words, we see that waters symbolize nations, multitudes that are restless, ungoverned, and under dark powers. From this sea, a beast emerges in Revelation 13, rising through chaos to attack God's people. As we get closer and deeper, we know that from the sea comes the beast that fights God's people at the end of time, specifically in Revelation 13 verse 1 and 17. It may look like a government or an institution, but it speaks like Satan, deceiving, demanding, and destroying. The earth, on the other hand, is depopulated, a land of freedom, which we will come to understand in this context was the United States. Here, God's people find temporary refuge. From this calm land arises a lamb-like beast, gentle at first, but speaking like a dragon when it turns against the truth. From the earth arises the lamb-like beast, who will persecute the faithful church during the final conflict. You can see that this is a tragic twist. A nation once known for freedom turns oppressive, joining the sea beast in its war against the faithful. Here comes the remnant people. So, God does not leave his people in the shade. He doesn't leave his people in the dark. As two beasts rise, a final message is given, spoken not in panic, but in prophecy. Let me take you through this very important detail. Revelation 10 verse 1 presents to us a strong angel who happens to be Christ himself. He descends in glory, not with swords, but with a scroll, a message for all lands and seas. In Revelation 10 verse 2, he brings a message to preach on land and the sea, which is the message of the book of Daniel. In fact, that old scroll, which was sealed for centuries, is now open and its meaning ready to be shared far and wide. Continuing, Revelation 10 verse 3 to 4 brings to us the interpretation, which is sealed because it was not yet time to know Daniel's interpretation. The message remains sealed, but now in the end times it must be declared. So we see in Revelation 10 verse 5 through 7, an oath is interposed like that of Daniel 12 verse 7. The message is for the time of the end. God swears by himself, it is time. The final warning must go out to every nation. We continue in verse 8 through 10 that the message would be sweet, but the results will be bitter. And this is well captured in the annals of history as the preaching of the second coming resulted in a great disappointment. In 1844, the world expected joy, but faced delay. Yet even in bitterness, God was refining his people. Finally, in Revelation 10 verse 11, it is necessary to prophesy again. And here we see the church, who is mandated to preach the last message to the world. Now is not the time to retreat. The church born from disappointment is called to deliver one final hopeful and urgent message. Friends, I believe the facts have been interesting. We see that from Eden to the beast, from metals to the sea, history is not random, but it is God's timeline filled with warnings, promises, and love. In this great conflict, the nations play their role, but the remnant also carry the message.